Before you ever negotiated a salary, opened a retirement account, or thought seriously about investing, your relationship with money was already forming, not in a finance class, not in a corporate training, but in the environment you grew up in. Childhood is where income ceilings are quietly introduced long before income exists. Many U.S. professionals today grew up in homes that were stable but cautious, responsible but restrained. There may not have been extreme scarcity, but there was often quiet tension around bills, mortgages, college costs, or job security. Maybe you remember your parents talking about layoffs during the 2008 recession. Maybe you heard phrases like, "We have to be careful," or "money doesn't grow on trees," or "be grateful for what you have." These statements were not harmful in intention. They were protective, but protection leaves impressions. As a child, you were not analyzing economic cycles. You were absorbing emotional signals. You were watching how adults reacted to money stress. You were noticing whether wealth was admired or quietly criticized. You were learning whether ambition was encouraged or gently limited by practicality. Over time, those observations became internal rules, not conscious rules, emotional ones. Rules about what is safe to earn, rules about how much risk is acceptable, rules about whether wanting more is admirable or selfish. Many thoughtful professionals believe their current income reflects skill, education, and work ethic. And those factors matter. But beneath them sits something quieter, a comfort zone that was built long before your first paycheck. If you grew up in a middle-class suburban environment where most families earned within a similar range, that range becomes psychologically normal. If no one around you started businesses, ownership may feel abstract or unstable. If your parents worked long hours for incremental raises, you may subconsciously equate earning more with sacrificing more. These early exposures shape expectations, and expectations quietly shape decisions. For example, when an opportunity arises that could significantly increase your income but requires stepping into uncertainty, your reaction may not be purely rational. It may feel like hesitation, but underneath that hesitation could be an inherited belief that stability equals safety, and safety must not be threatened. Intelligent professionals often assume they are immune to childhood conditioning because they understand markets, inflation, investing, and negotiation strategies. But understanding does not erase emotional memory. The body reacts faster than logic. A higher-paying role that carries performance pressure may trigger anxiety. Starting a side business may feel irresponsible, even if the downside is manageable. Raising your prices may feel uncomfortable, even when the value justifies it. These reactions are rarely about spreadsheets. They are about identity, the identity you formed early in life around money, security, and belonging. Income growth often requires not just new strategies, but new self-permission. And self-permission is difficult when your nervous system still associates expansion with risk to stability, approval, or safety. Childhood beliefs do not disappear when circumstances improve. They simply become invisible. And invisible beliefs are powerful because they operate without resistance. They guide your risk tolerance, your negotiation confidence, your investment decisions, and even your career choices. The first step in understanding your income is not analyzing the market. It is asking yourself what money meant in your home when you were young. Because before income becomes a number, it is an emotional story. And most adults are still quietly living inside the first version of that story. Chapter 2. If childhood is where your emotional story about money begins, then adolescence is where that story becomes identity. As you moved from observing your parents to forming your own ambitions, certain beliefs likely solidified into quiet conclusions about who you needed to be in order to feel safe and respected. In many American households, especially middle-class and upper-middle-class ones, stability was treated as a virtue. A good job meant predictable income, benefits, retirement contributions, and upward mobility through structured effort. Risk was not necessarily condemned, but it was rarely modeled. Entrepreneurship may have been admired from a distance, but employment was what paid the mortgage. Over time, you may have internalized the idea that responsible adults prioritize security first and opportunity second. That hierarchy matters, because when security always comes first, expansion becomes conditional. You tell yourself you'll take more risk later, invest more aggressively later, negotiate harder later, but later often never feels safe enough. Another belief that quietly forms during these years is the connection between money and approval. Many high-achieving professionals were praised for discipline, grades, reliability, and being mature for their age. Achievement became the currency of validation. And once validation is tied to performance, income becomes more than income. It becomes proof. Proof that you are capable, proof that you made the right choices, proof that the sacrifices were worth it. The danger here is subtle. When money becomes proof of worth, financial decisions stop being strategic and start being emotional. You may stay in a prestigious role that pays well but drains you because it maintains your identity. You may avoid changing industries because your current salary signals success to others. You may chase incremental raises not because they meaningfully change your life, but because they reinforce the narrative that you are progressing. In this way, childhood approval patterns quietly merge with adult income behavior. There is also the influence of comparison. Growing up in environments where neighbors lived in similar homes, drove similar cars, and followed similar career paths creates an invisible boundary around what feels normal. If most families in your childhood circle operated within a certain income band, that band becomes your internal benchmark. Surpassing it may feel exhilarating at first, but also destabilizing. Humans are wired for belonging. If earning significantly more than your peers or family creates emotional distance, part of you may unconsciously regulate growth to preserve connection. This isn't sabotage, it's social self-protection. And for thoughtful professionals who value relationships, that pull can be stronger than the pull toward wealth expansion. Additionally, many adults carry forward an inherited equation. Money equals effort. If you watched your parents work long hours, sacrifice weekends, or endure stress to maintain financial stability, you may have absorbed the belief that earning more requires enduring more. So when opportunities arise that allow for leverage, scaling income without proportional increases in effort, they may feel suspicious. It can feel as though you are breaking an unspoken rule. That discomfort isn't about fairness, it's about familiarity. Your nervous system trusts what it has seen repeatedly. Anything outside that pattern feels unstable, even if mathematically advantageous. What makes all of this powerful is that none of these beliefs announce themselves loudly. They show up as preferences. You prefer stability, you prefer predictable growth, you prefer roles with clear ladders, you prefer saving over investing aggressively. You prefer staying slightly under your potential rather than testing the edges of it. And because these preferences feel reasonable, you rarely question them. But reasonable does not always mean aligned with your highest potential. It may simply mean aligned with your earliest conditioning. The goal is not to reject your upbringing or judge your parents' decisions. They likely did the best they could with the information and circumstances they had. The goal is awareness, because once you see that some of your financial instincts were formed before you had agency, you gain the power to evaluate them consciously. You can ask, is this caution strategic or inherited? Is this ceiling realistic or familiar? Is this hesitation about data or about identity? Income growth often begins not with learning something new, but with re-examining something old. And the old stories about money are usually quieter and more influential than we realize. Chapter 3. As these early beliefs settle into adulthood, they begin to shape not just how much you earn, but how you make decisions under pressure. Most professionals assume that their financial choices are logical responses to current market conditions, career opportunities, and economic realities. But beneath logic sits something older, a deeply embedded sense of what feels safe. And safety, for most people, was defined long before their first job offer. Consider how you respond to uncertainty. When markets fluctuate, when layoffs are announced, when promotions feel competitive, your reaction is rarely neutral. It carries emotional weight. For many Americans who grew up hearing stories of job insecurity, economic downturns, or financial strain, uncertainty doesn't just represent volatility. It represents threat. Even if you are financially stable today, your body may react as if stability could vanish overnight. This often leads to overcorrection. You may hold excessive cash instead of investing. You may avoid changing roles even when growth is limited. You may decline opportunities that carry upside because the downside feels disproportionately dangerous. The math might support a calculated risk, but your nervous system is calculating something else entirely: emotional safety. Another powerful childhood imprint revolves around the meaning of enough. In some homes, enough meant survival. In others, it meant modest comfort. Rarely did it mean abundance. If you grew up in an environment where financial comfort was framed as fragile or temporary, you may unconsciously stop pushing once you reach a level that feels secure. Not because you lack ambition, but because part of you believes that going further invites instability. Success beyond a certain point can feel like overreaching. This is why many capable professionals plateau. They reach a respectable salary, a stable role, a comfortable lifestyle, and then momentum slows. On the surface, it appears balanced and responsible, but internally, it may be a subconscious honoring of an inherited definition of enough. There is also the subtle link between money and morality. Many children absorb cues about wealth being associated with greed, arrogance, or loss of values. Even if those messages were indirect, they can linger. As an adult, you might hesitate to aggressively pursue higher income because you don't want to become that kind of person. You might downplay financial success to remain relatable. You might avoid bold negotiation because it feels self-serving. These patterns rarely show up as moral dilemmas in your conscious mind. Instead, they show up as mild discomfort around expansion. That discomfort gently steers your decisions toward moderation, even when you are capable of more. Intelligent professionals are particularly susceptible to these quiet limits because they can rationalize them convincingly. They can justify caution as prudence. They can frame stagnation as stability. They can interpret fear as responsibility. And because these interpretations sound mature, they rarely get challenged. But there is a difference between wisdom and inherited fear. Wisdom evaluates present reality. Inherited fear reacts to past experience. When you notice recurring hesitation around income growth, it's worth asking which one is speaking. Another dimension of childhood conditioning is loyalty. Many professionals who out-earn their parents or peer groups experience subtle guilt. Even if it is never spoken, there can be an internal tension between advancement and belonging. Earning significantly more than your family once did may feel like stepping into unfamiliar territory. It can create emotional distance, even if no one explicitly expresses it. To preserve connection, some people unconsciously limit their upward mobility. They stay within ranges that feel socially comfortable. This isn't conscious self-sabotage. It is relational alignment. Humans instinctively protect their sense of belonging, and if growth threatens that belonging, the subconscious often intervenes. The result of all these patterns is not dramatic failure. It is subtle containment, slightly smaller risks, slightly lower pricing, slightly delayed pivots, slightly conservative investments. Over years, these small decisions compound, not into collapse, but into ceilings. The most profound insight here is that your income may not reflect your capability. It may reflect your comfort. And comfort is often built from childhood observations about money, security, morality, and belonging. To expand income sustainably, you must expand what feels safe. That does not mean reckless behavior. It means gradually teaching your nervous system that growth does not equal danger. Because until growth feels safe, your inherited definitions of stability will quietly dictate how far you allow yourself to go. Chapter 4. One of the most subtle ways childhood beliefs influence income is through the definition of risk, not the financial definition, the emotional one. When you hear the word risk, what do you actually feel? For many professionals, risk is not simply uncertainty. It is exposure. It is vulnerability. It is the possibility of being wrong, being judged, or being unstable. And those emotional associations rarely formed in adulthood. They formed much earlier. If you grew up in a household where mistakes were expensive, where financial errors caused stress, or where failure carried visible consequences, your nervous system may have learned to associate experimentation with danger. Even if your adult life is stable and your savings are solid, your internal wiring may still respond to financial risk as if survival is on the line. This shows up in subtle ways. You might delay investing because you want more certainty. You might stay in a role that limits your income because it feels predictable. You might underprice your work because rejection feels threatening. None of these behaviors appear irrational on the surface, They appear cautious. But caution rooted in outdated emotional memory can quietly cap expansion. There is also the matter of control. Many children in financially uncertain environments learn that control reduces anxiety. Budget tightly, plan carefully, avoid surprises. As adults, this can evolve into over-control. You may feel uneasy delegating, uneasy investing in volatile markets, uneasy stepping into situations where outcomes are not fully predictable. The irony is that wealth often requires a calibrated relationship with uncertainty. Long-term investing requires tolerating volatility. Entrepreneurship requires navigating ambiguity. Negotiation requires embracing possible rejection. If your early environment trained you to eliminate uncertainty rather than manage it, your adult income growth may stall at the edge of unpredictability. Another childhood imprint that quietly influences income is the association between effort and virtue. Many Americans were raised to believe that hard work is not just practical, but morally superior. Rest without earning it may feel indulgent. Scaling income without proportional labor may feel undeserved. If you absorb the equation that money must equal visible effort, you may unconsciously resist leverage-based growth. Opportunities that allow you to earn more through systems, ownership, or strategic positioning can feel uncomfortable because they disrupt the familiar formula of work hard, earn modestly, repeat. This discomfort is rarely conscious. It manifests as skepticism. It sounds too easy. There must be a catch. I don't want to get ahead of myself. Yet often, what feels suspicious is simply unfamiliar. Another powerful belief formed in childhood involves visibility. In some families, standing out financially was discouraged. Blending in was safer. Being too ambitious risked criticism. If you internalize the message that modesty protects you, income growth beyond your immediate environment can trigger unease. You may hesitate to share wins. You may downplay raises. You may avoid bold career moves because they increase scrutiny. Visibility becomes intertwined with vulnerability. And if vulnerability feels unsafe, growth feels risky. What's important to recognize is that these patterns are rarely dramatic. They don't cause obvious collapse. They create gentle ceilings. You continue progressing, but within limits that feel psychologically manageable. The ceiling feels rational because it aligns with early definitions of safety, virtue, and belonging. But those definitions were formed in a different context. You are no longer the child observing financial tension. You are an adult with agency, skill, and perspective. The question is not whether your childhood beliefs were right or wrong. The question is whether they are still accurate for your current reality. Risk in adulthood is rarely the same as risk in childhood. A missed investment today is not the same as a missed mortgage payment in your parents' home. A career pivot now is not the same as unemployment during a recession you witnessed as a child. Yet the body can blur those distinctions. Income growth requires recalibrating your relationship with risk. Not eliminating caution, but updating it. Learning to differentiate between genuine financial threat and inherited emotional discomfort. Because many professionals are not limited by lack of knowledge or opportunity. They are limited by an outdated nervous system definition of danger. And until that definition evolves, their income will remain aligned with what feels safe rather than what is strategically possible. Chapter 5. Another childhood belief that quietly shapes income is the idea of what kind of life is realistic for someone like you. This belief rarely arrives as a clear statement. It forms gradually through observation. You watch the adults around you, you see the neighborhoods they live in, the cars they drive, the vacations they take, the careers they pursue. Without consciously deciding, your mind builds a mental model of what is normal. That model becomes the backdrop against which all future ambition is measured. For many professionals in the United States, especially those raised in stable middle-class environments, normal meant comfort but not excess, security but not abundance. A steady paycheck was admirable. A stable retirement plan was success. Owning a home was the milestone. Rarely did the model include large-scale ownership, aggressive investing, or financial independence at an early age. So, even as you grow in skill and opportunity, your internal benchmark may remain anchored to what you witnessed growing up. When your income approaches or slightly surpasses that benchmark, something subtle happens. The urgency to expand often softens. not because you've reached your full potential, but because you've reached your inherited definition of success. The mind relaxes at familiarity. It says, this is enough. And enough is not a bad concept. But enough based on inherited expectations can quietly limit what is possible. There is also the influence of class identity. Even if your current income places you solidly in upper middle territory, your psychological identity may still feel rooted in where you began. If you were raised to see wealth as something belonging to other people, crossing into that territory can feel destabilizing. It can create internal tension between advancement and authenticity. You may fear becoming disconnected from your origins. You may worry about being perceived differently by family or longtime friends. As a result, you unconsciously regulate how far you allow yourself to go. Income growth becomes not just a financial matter, but a relational one. Another early imprint involves expectations around sacrifice. Many children observe adults trading time, energy, and sometimes well-being for financial stability. The lesson absorbed is that money requires depletion. As an adult, this can shape how you evaluate opportunity. If an option promises significant income growth but does not appear to require visible struggle, it may feel suspicious. Conversely, roles that are demanding and exhausting may feel legitimate because they match the original script. This dynamic keeps many professionals locked into high-effort, linear growth paths rather than exploring leverage, ownership, or strategic positioning. It is not lack of intelligence that limits them. It is loyalty to an inherited formula. There is also the belief about ambition itself. In some households, ambition was quietly moderated, not discouraged outright, but softened with reminders to be practical, to avoid arrogance, to stay grounded. These messages often carried warmth and care, but they also defined invisible boundaries. As an adult, pushing beyond those boundaries can trigger guilt or self-doubt. You may question whether wanting significantly more income is excessive. You may worry about appearing greedy or disconnected from your values. Yet ambition, when aligned with contribution and growth, is not inherently selfish. The tension arises because your early environment equated expansion with risk to humility or harmony. What makes these beliefs powerful is that they operate beneath awareness. You may believe you are simply being balanced, practical, or grateful, and perhaps you are. But it is worth asking whether gratitude has quietly turned into containment, whether practicality has become self-limitation, whether humility has blurred into hesitation. Income ceilings are rarely declared out loud, they are lived quietly. They form when your adult capability outpaces your childhood expectations, but your nervous system still defers to the older blueprint. To move beyond inherited realism, you must first recognize that realism itself is contextual. What was realistic in your parents' era may not reflect the opportunities available to you. What was normal in your neighborhood may not represent the full range of possibility. Expanding income does not require rejecting your roots. It requires updating your reference point. Because until your definition of what is possible evolves, your financial life will continue orbiting the boundaries set long before you had the power to question them. Chapter 6. There is another childhood belief that quietly shapes income, and it has less to do with money itself and more to do with identity. Specifically, who you learned you had to be in order to feel safe, valued, and loved. In many households, roles form early. One child becomes the responsible one, another becomes the achiever, another becomes the peacekeeper. These roles often develop in response to emotional or financial dynamics in the home. If money created stress, someone may have learned to minimize their needs. If achievement brought praise, someone may have learned to overperform. If instability threatened harmony, someone may have learned to avoid conflict at all costs. These patterns follow you into adulthood, and they follow you into your financial life. If you became the responsible one, you may carry a deep internal rule that says you must never be reckless. Even when a calculated risk could meaningfully increase your income, part of you may resist because risk threatens your identity as the stable one. If you became the achiever, income may feel inseparable from validation. You may push yourself relentlessly, chasing higher compensation not purely for strategic growth, but to maintain your self-image. The danger there is burnout, not stagnation. If you became the peacekeeper, negotiation may feel uncomfortable. Asking for more may feel confrontational, You may under-earn not because you lack value, but because asserting that value feels disruptive. These identity roles often override financial logic. They influence how you show up in performance reviews, how you price your services, how you respond to opportunities, and how you tolerate uncertainty. And because these roles once protected you, they feel correct. They feel like who you are. But who you are is often who you adapted to be. And adaptation is not the same as alignment. Many U.S. professionals operate from identities formed in environments that no longer match their current reality. As children, stability was survival, approval was security, minimizing conflict preserved connection. But as adults with agency, skill, and resources, those same adaptations can restrict growth. For example, if your identity is anchored in being dependable and cautious, you may unconsciously avoid income paths that involve bold visibility or experimentation. You may over-prepare before acting. You may wait for certainty that never fully arrives. Meanwhile, opportunities pass, not because you are incapable, but because the old identity resists expansion. Another layer of this belief involves how you see yourself in relation to wealth. If you never saw someone like you holding significant financial power, it may feel unfamiliar to step into that role. Wealth is not just numbers. It is visibility, influence, responsibility. If your childhood environment did not model that identity, stepping into it can feel isolating. So you gravitate toward levels of success that feel recognizable. The mind prefers continuity. It resists radical shifts in self-concept. This is why income growth often requires identity growth first. You cannot sustainably earn beyond the level your self-concept allows. If you still see yourself as someone who plays it safe, who stays modest, who avoids standing out, your financial life will reflect that narrative. The work, then, is not to abandon your core values. It is to separate values from roles. Responsibility does not require smallness. Achievement does not require exhaustion. Harmony does not require under-earning. As you update your identity, your relationship with income begins to shift. You start making decisions based on present capability rather than past adaptation. You start tolerating calculated discomfort because it no longer threatens who you believe you must be. And slowly, your financial behavior aligns less with childhood survival strategies and more with adult intention. Until that shift happens, income remains tethered to roles you may have outgrown long ago. Chapter 7. Another belief that quietly forms in childhood and deeply affects income in adulthood is the belief about what money says about you. Not what it does for you, but what it means about your character. In many American homes, money was not just practical, it was moralized. Being careful was praised. Being wasteful was criticized. Being stable was admirable. Being overly ambitious could be viewed with suspicion. Even if these messages were subtle, they accumulate. As a child, you begin to associate certain financial behaviors with being a good person and others with being reckless, arrogant, or selfish. Over time, that moral coding becomes internalized. As an adult, you might feel tension when pursuing higher income because it activates unconscious questions. Will this change me? Will people see me differently? Will I lose humility? The desire to remain grounded can quietly conflict with the desire to expand financially. Many thoughtful professionals experience this without recognizing it. They tell themselves they value balance, simplicity, or modesty, and those values are valid. But sometimes they mask an inherited discomfort with wealth itself. If wealth was portrayed in your environment as something that corrupts or distances people from their roots, you may unconsciously limit your financial growth to preserve your sense of integrity. This does not mean you reject money. It means you regulate it. You allow yourself to earn well, but not too well, to invest, but cautiously, to succeed, but quietly. Another dimension of this belief involves visibility. Higher income often increases visibility. It can shift your social circle, it can change expectations, it can alter how others perceive your choices. If you grew up learning that staying modest protected you from criticism or envy, you may instinctively avoid situations that elevate your financial profile. Negotiating assertively, starting a business, or investing boldly can all increase visibility. And visibility can feel emotionally risky if, in childhood, attention was associated with scrutiny rather than support. The body remembers those early dynamics. Even when you logically know that adult environments are different, Your nervous system may respond as if the old rules still apply. There's also the belief about deserving. Children absorb cues about fairness quickly. If resources were scarce, you may have learned to minimize your own desires to keep the peace. If your family sacrificed for your education or opportunities, you may carry a quiet sense of obligation. As your income grows, part of you may feel uneasy enjoying it fully. You might overextend financially to support others. You might hesitate to invest in yourself. You might downplay your achievements to avoid appearing ungrateful. This is not a flaw in character, it is loyalty. But loyalty, when unconscious, can quietly limit expansion. What makes these beliefs so influential is that they blend into your personality. You might say, "I'm just cautious. I don't need much. I don't care about money that much." And perhaps you truly value simplicity. But it is worth examining whether those statements originated in choice or in conditioning. If you had grown up in an environment where wealth was normalized, visible, and ethically integrated, would your comfort level with higher income look different? Would negotiation feel less threatening? Would ambition feel cleaner? Often, income ceilings are not about skill or opportunity. They are about internal permission. And internal permission is shaped by early moral narratives around money. When you begin to separate wealth from worth and expansion from ego, you create space to redefine what financial growth means. Wealth does not have to change your character. It can amplify your values. It can increase your capacity to contribute. But until your nervous system believes that, it may continue to regulate your income to remain within morally comfortable territory. And that regulation happens quietly through small decisions that accumulate over time. Chapter 8. There is another layer to childhood conditioning that quietly shapes your income, and it has to do with how conflict was handled in your home. Not financial conflict alone, but emotional conflict around expectations, pressure, and disagreement. If money conversations in your childhood environment were tense, avoidant, or emotionally charged, you may have learned that discussing money openly is uncomfortable. You may have learned that asking for more creates friction. You may have absorbed the idea that financial conversations are stressful rather than strategic. As an adult, this can show up in subtle but costly ways. Salary negotiations may feel disproportionately intimidating. Discussing pricing with clients may create internal anxiety. Bringing up compensation with leadership may feel like confrontation rather than collaboration. And because thoughtful professionals tend to value harmony, avoiding friction can feel like maturity. But income growth often requires the willingness to tolerate short-term discomfort in service of long-term alignment. If your nervous system associates money discussions with emotional volatility, you may unconsciously avoid the very conversations that increase income. This avoidance does not look dramatic. It looks polite. It looks patient. It looks reasonable. But over years, the cost compounds. Another early belief that forms quietly is the belief about control versus trust. In some households, financial planning was rigid. Every dollar was tracked, every expense scrutinized, mistakes were not easily forgiven. In others, money was unpredictable. Bills were sometimes late, plans shifted, promises around finances were uncertain. Both extremes shape adult income behavior differently. If you grew up around rigid control, you may struggle with flexibility in financial strategy. You may find it difficult to tolerate market fluctuations or business variability. You may default to conservative choices even when your resources allow for thoughtful risk. If you grew up around unpredictability, you may either overcorrect toward extreme caution or unconsciously recreate volatility because it feels familiar. The mind seeks patterns it recognizes, even if they are not optimal. These early dynamics also influence how you perceive authority and opportunity. If financial decision-making in your home felt hierarchical, where one person held all control and others had little voice, you may hesitate to assert yourself financially in professional settings. You may defer to leadership even when you have leverage. You may assume that higher compensation is granted, not negotiated. Conversely, if you witnessed financial instability tied to poor decisions, you may carry an internal rule that says you must never misstep. That rule can create paralysis. It can make every financial decision feel heavy, as though one wrong move could unravel everything. Intelligent professionals often pride themselves on being careful, but when careful turns into fearful, growth slows. It is also worth examining how success was emotionally received in your childhood. Were accomplishments celebrated openly, or were they met with caution, as reminders to stay humble, warnings not to attract too much attention? If praise felt conditional or limited, you may subconsciously minimize your achievements as an adult. You may downplay raises. You may avoid visibility. You may shrink in moments that require confidence. And income, particularly at higher levels, requires confidence, not arrogance, but grounded assurance in your value. If your early environment did not consistently reinforce that confidence, you may hesitate at the threshold of expansion. The central theme here is not blame. It is awareness. Childhood environments shape nervous systems. Nervous systems shape behavior, and behavior shapes income. When you notice discomfort around negotiation, risk, visibility, or financial conversations, it is useful to ask whether the intensity of that discomfort matches your present reality or echoes your past. Many professionals are operating with emotional software installed decades ago. That software once protected them, but now it may be limiting them. Updating it does not require rejecting your upbringing. It requires recognizing that you are no longer the child navigating someone else's financial stress. You are an adult with resources, perspective, and agency. And until your nervous system fully understands that, it will continue steering your income decisions toward familiarity rather than possibility. Chapter 9. As you move further into adulthood, these childhood beliefs begin to influence something even more subtle, your long-term financial vision. Not just how much you earn this year, but how far you allow yourself to think. Many professionals set goals based on what feels reasonable rather than what is strategically possible, and reasonable is often inherited. If, as a child, long-term financial conversations centered around retirement at 65, paying off the mortgage, and maintaining stability, then those milestones become your internal blueprint. Financial independence at 40 may feel excessive. Building significant equity through ownership may feel ambitious in a way that triggers doubt. Even imagining large-scale wealth can feel abstract or disconnected from your lived experience, so you default to incremental thinking. A slightly higher salary, a slightly larger savings account, a slightly better investment return. Incremental thinking is safe. It does not disrupt identity. It does not threaten belonging, but it can also quietly limit scale. There is also the influence of how your family handled aspiration. In some homes, dreaming big was encouraged but tempered with caution. That's great, but be realistic. Have a backup plan. Don't take unnecessary risks. These phrases were meant to protect you, but over time, they shape the boundaries of your imagination. As an adult, when you consider bold career shifts, entrepreneurial ventures, or aggressive investment strategies, an internal voice may question whether you are stepping beyond what is appropriate. You may talk yourself out of opportunities before fully exploring them, not because they are unwise, but because they stretch your inherited definition of acceptable ambition. Another quiet belief that forms early involves how wealth changes relationships. If you observed tension around money between adults, arguments about spending, resentment about income disparities, stress around debt, you may unconsciously associate financial growth with relational strain. This can create a paradox. You want to earn more, but part of you fears that earning more could destabilize harmony. As a result, you may regulate your ambition to preserve relational comfort. You might choose roles that are respected but not expansive. You might avoid high-earning paths that require intense focus or relocation. You might prioritize familiarity over opportunity. These decisions appear balanced, but sometimes they are rooted in early emotional associations between money and conflict. Additionally, childhood exposure influences how you perceive time in relation to money. If financial stress was immediate and urgent in your home, you may have learned to prioritize short-term security over long-term compounding. Even if you intellectually understand investing principles, your instinct may lean toward immediate stability. You may overvalue liquidity. You may hesitate to commit to long-term strategies that require patience. The body seeks relief from uncertainty, even if the long-term cost is slower growth. Intelligent professionals often underestimate how deeply time preference is emotional. Delayed gratification is not just discipline, it is nervous system regulation. If waiting once felt unsafe, waiting now can feel risky, even when it is rational. The cumulative effect of these beliefs is that your financial future is often framed within a narrow band of possibility. You aim for stability, comfort, and gradual progress, and those are respectable goals. But if your capabilities, market value, and access to information exceed that inherited framework, you may be living below your true potential. Expanding your income requires expanding your vision, and expanding your vision requires questioning whether your current goals are truly yours or echoes of what felt attainable in your childhood environment. When you begin to consciously redefine what is realistic, you loosen the grip of inherited limits. You allow yourself to consider ownership, leverage, strategic risk, and long-term scale, not as threats to stability, but as evolutions of it. Because financial security and financial expansion are not opposites. They only appear that way when your earliest definitions of safety remain unexamined. Chapter 10. At this point, it becomes clear that childhood beliefs do not control income in dramatic, visible ways. They influence it quietly through patterns of hesitation, preference, and perceived safety. But one of the most powerful ways they persist is through repetition. The longer you make decisions aligned with inherited conditioning, the more those decisions reinforce your identity, and the more your identity reinforces your income level. So, this is how ceilings become stable. For example, if you repeatedly decline opportunities that feel slightly beyond your comfort zone, you build a narrative about yourself. I prefer stability. If you consistently undernegotiate compensation, you build another narrative. I'm not the kind of person who pushes hard for money. If you avoid visibility, you tell yourself, I value privacy more than expansion. Over time, these narratives feel factual, but they are often the result of early emotional wiring playing out in modern circumstances. The repetition is subtle. It happens in small choices: how assertively you speak in meetings, how confidently you price your work, how aggressively you invest, how early you begin planning for scale rather than maintenance. Each choice by itself appears minor, but together they compound into a financial trajectory, and that trajectory often mirrors the psychological boundaries you absorbed long ago. There is also the reinforcement loop of social environment. As your income stabilizes within a certain range, you naturally surround yourself with people in similar circumstances. That similarity reinforces what feels normal. Conversations revolve around similar salaries, similar investments, similar aspirations. The environment confirms your inherited expectations. This is not intentional limitation. It is human tendency. We calibrate ourselves to those around us. If your childhood environment defined a certain level of financial comfort as success, and your adult environment mirrors that level, it becomes even harder to question whether more is possible or desirable. Breaking this loop requires conscious discomfort. Not reckless action, but intentional stretching. It requires small, strategic exposures to ideas, environments, and conversations that expand your definition of normal. It requires observing individuals who have built wealth ethically and responsibly, so that your nervous system can update its association between money and morality. It requires practicing negotiation in low-stakes contexts, so that conflict no longer feels dangerous. It requires gradual exposure to investment volatility so that uncertainty becomes tolerable rather than threatening. The goal is not to abandon caution, it is to recalibrate it. Many professionals assume that income growth is primarily about acquiring new skills. And while skills matter, they often sit on top of deeper patterns. If your internal narrative says you must stay within a certain band to remain safe, valued, or connected, new skills will only take you so far. You may acquire knowledge about investing, but hesitate to act decisively. You may develop business acumen, but avoid launching something that feels too visible. You may earn promotions, but resist larger pivots that require identity expansion. What makes childhood beliefs so influential is not their intensity, but their invisibility. They operate quietly, below conscious awareness, shaping your perception of risk, ambition, and possibility. The work of expanding income, then, is as much psychological as it is strategic. It involves identifying the internal rules you never consciously chose. It involves questioning whether your current financial life reflects your true capability or your inherited comfort zone. And most importantly, it involves recognizing that updating these beliefs is not betrayal, it is evolution. Your parents' caution may have been appropriate for their era. Your childhood environment may have shaped you for survival. But you are no longer navigating the world with the same constraints. As you begin to consciously choose which beliefs to carry forward and which to release, your financial trajectory can shift. Not abruptly, but steadily. Because when awareness interrupts repetition, the loop begins to loosen. And once the loop loosens, new decisions become possible. Decisions aligned not with old fears, but with present potential. Chapter 11. If childhood beliefs quietly build ceilings, then awareness is what begins to dismantle them. But awareness alone is not enough. Many professionals can intellectually recognize that their upbringing shaped their relationship with money. They can see patterns, they can identify fears, and yet their financial behavior does not immediately change. That is because these beliefs are not stored as ideas. They are stored as sensations, as emotional responses, as subtle shifts in the body when risk appears. You can know that negotiating a higher salary is reasonable and still feel tightness in your chest when the conversation approaches. You can understand that long-term investing is rational and still feel anxious during market dips. This gap between understanding and action is where inherited conditioning lives, and it is also where growth must happen. The process of updating childhood beliefs is gradual. It requires repeated evidence that expansion does not equal danger. It requires experiences where you negotiate and survive, where you invest and endure volatility, where you increase visibility and remain connected. Each of these experiences teaches your nervous system something new, that growth can coexist with safety, that ambition does not automatically lead to loss of belonging, that earning more does not make you less grounded. For many U.S. professionals, especially those raised in environments that emphasized caution and stability, this recalibration is subtle but transformative. You begin by noticing the moments where hesitation feels disproportionate to the actual risk. You pause before defaulting to familiar restraint. You ask whether the fear in front of you belongs to the present or echoes the past. Sometimes the answer will be that caution is appropriate. Not all risks are wise, but sometimes you will realize that what feels threatening is simply unfamiliar. And unfamiliar is not the same as unsafe. Another important step in this evolution is redefining what wealth represents. If wealth in your childhood environment was associated with greed, arrogance, or moral compromise, your subconscious will resist it. But wealth can also represent flexibility, contribution, and agency. It can represent the ability to support family without stress, the ability to choose work aligned with your values, the ability to absorb uncertainty without panic. When you consciously redefine wealth as an extension of responsibility rather than a departure from it, your internal resistance softens. You no longer see income growth as stepping away from who you are. You see it as expanding your capacity. Identity shifts are rarely dramatic. They happen in quiet internal moments. The first time you ask for more without apologizing. The first time you invest confidently despite short-term fluctuation. The first time you consider ownership instead of employment as your default path. Each of these moments signals to your nervous system that the rules have changed, that you are no longer confined to the emotional logic of your childhood home, that you can honor where you came from without being limited by it. Income growth in this sense is not just financial progression, it is psychological evolution. It reflects the degree to which you have updated your internal definition of safety, ambition, and belonging. The more your nervous system trusts that expansion is survivable, the more your behavior aligns with your actual capability. And when behavior aligns with capability, income tends to follow. Not because the world suddenly changes, but because you do. Childhood beliefs may have quietly shaped your starting point, but they do not have to define your trajectory. That shift, from inherited conditioning to conscious choice, is where financial ceilings begin to lift. Chapter 12. By now, it should be clear that your income is not simply the result of your education, your intelligence, or your effort. It is also the result of the emotional framework you inherited long before you ever signed a contract or negotiated a salary. Childhood did not determine your financial destiny, but it quietly shaped your starting boundaries. It defined what felt safe to earn, what felt excessive to want, what felt risky to pursue, and what felt responsible to maintain. For many thoughtful professionals, those early definitions have been operating silently for decades. You may have built a respectable income, a stable career, a comfortable life, and yet still feel a subtle tension around growth. That tension is rarely about capability. It is about familiarity. The mind prefers what it recognizes, and if your childhood environment equated stability with safety, modesty with morality, and caution with responsibility, expansion can feel emotionally complex. But awareness changes the equation. When you begin to recognize that hesitation is sometimes inherited rather than strategic, you gain leverage. You begin to notice where you undernegotiate, where you overprotect, where you shrink your ambition to remain comfortable. And instead of judging yourself, you ask a better question. Is this choice aligned with who I am today or who I had to be then? That distinction is powerful because you are no longer navigating your parents' economy. You are not the child absorbing tension at the dinner table. You are an adult with agency, perspective, and access to opportunity. The skills you've built, the experience you've accumulated, the networks you've developed, all of it exists in a different context than the one that shaped your earliest beliefs. Updating those beliefs does not require rejecting your roots. It requires evolving them. Responsibility does not mean smallness. Stability does not require stagnation. Humility does not demand under-earning. As you gradually recalibrate what feels safe, your financial behavior shifts. You negotiate with steadier confidence, you invest with longer vision, you evaluate risk with clarity rather than inherited fear, and over time, your income begins to reflect present potential instead of past conditioning. This shift is not dramatic, it is deliberate, it is quiet, it is internal before it is visible. And that is where real wealth begins, not with numbers, but with awareness. If these conversations resonate with you, if you find yourself questioning long-held assumptions about money and identity, then you are exactly who this space was built for. Mindful wealth exists to explore these deeper layers, the psychology behind income, the invisible ceilings, the decisions that compound over years. If you value thoughtful, long-form conversations about money and life, consider subscribing and returning to these discussions regularly. Because financial growth is not just about earning more, it is about thinking differently, consciously, and with intention. And that shift, steady, aware, and aligned, is what ultimately changes your trajectory.